My choice will be a logical one, arrived at through logical means.
Hello, welcome to this little recording on the subject of reason versus emotion. And what I've done here is to choose some stereotypical characters out of the traditional Star Trek, the old one. Maybe before the time of some of you, but I'm sure that you've at least become aware of the fact that Star Trek interest has been regenerated as of about last summer, with different people portraying the parts of Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk. But typically Mr. Spock, as you see over here to the left, is portrayed, at least in the series Star Trek, as a highly logical individual who tends to diminish the role of intuition and emotion in his judgment making and decision making and evaluation of problems. Whereas Captain Kirk, while he uses reason, seems to allow emotion, reason, passion to function in the decisions and actions he makes, and not always correctly, mind you. But nevertheless, Kirk is one of those characters, fictional characters of course, that is portrayed more as an intelligent human being who has marvelous human capacities to be able to deal with various kinds of events and scenarios. Spock too, as an alien hybrid entity, as an extraterrestrial being, also has highly advanced skills and competencies, but in Spock's case, of course, he principally relies upon reason in order to arrive at conclusions. But let's do a little bit of a review. Let's talk about some questions that we might have asked ourselves in reading the last chapter and going over some previous material in your main textbook. Let's talk about this question and see what you come up with. If I gave you a multiple choice question right now, what would your answer be? A collection of skills we use every day that are necessary for our full intellectual and personal development is defined by the text as opinions, logic, critical thinking, or worldview. Yep, critical thinking is right, and I'm sure you got that. I'll give you a little bit more time to discover the answer on this one. A belief based solely on personal feelings rather than on reason or facts is called... That's correct. Opinion. Good for you. Number 3. The act of seeking out only evidence that supports one's views while dismissing as unreliable contradictory evidence is defined as... That's right. Confirmation bias. Another question. A method of critical analysis in which we put aside our preconceived ideas and beliefs and begin from a position of skepticism is called... Now, if you know these terms a little bit, you can do the process of elimination. Method of doubt. That's correct. Of course, it's clear that reason and emotion play important roles in critical thinking, and to some extent they shake hands, if I may use that expression, with each other. They mutually interact in order for us to be able, as human beings, to come to conclusions and arrive at decisions about how we should behave and what we should do. We hope to be able to stress the fact that in life, you're probably not going to be able to eliminate emotion completely in favor of reason, but it's good to endow certain kinds of things that are emotional or emotionally laden with a dose of reason. Understanding the roles as separate and combined influences is important to thinking critically. We can define reason as the process of supporting a claim or conclusion based on evidence, and of course when you do an argument, try to bear this in mind. When you write an argument paper, basically what you're doing is writing it along these lines. Now, I mentioned in our orientation video that there are several places you can go in the website in Blackboard to get an idea as to what kind of a paper is expected of you. But basically what we're talking about is a claim that is being made for which you provide reasons as evidence. So that's a reasonable approach to take. Reason involves the disciplined use of intelligence and, of course, application of rules for problem solving. Remember, reason or critical thinking is not simply about writing argument papers, but it can also be applied to certain kinds of problem solving. And a little bit later on, I'll give you a little challenge puzzle to try to figure out that I always enjoy presenting to any of my face-to-face courses. Now, in logic, reasoning is presented in a very structured form. However, in critical thinking, we tend to rely more on everyday uses of reason and a little bit broader in scope and also application. And we don't want to exclude what we would call creativity or creative thought, as well as mature emotional discernment. When you talk about reason, you have to talk about a couple of important components, of course. These components include the ability to engage in abstract thinking, argumentation, and also modifying your own behavior. If you can actually sit down and reasonably decide, for example, that you're going to make an investment based upon certain kinds of reasons or evidence that is presented, that's like making a claim. I am going to invest in some different stock company. Why is that? Now think about it from that context. If you simply did the proverbial use your own hunches or your own intuition and only that about what stock to buy, you're probably not going to get very far. Most people who have claimed that they gamble that way don't seem to be that successful. Reason also involves the embrace of different cognitive strategies, including deduction, generalization, imagination. We'll be studying deduction, generalization in terms of deductive and inductive logic, and a little bit of creativity too, which involves imagination as the course proceeds. It's important in spatio-temporal problem solving, particularly in fields such as mathematics, engineering, and architecture. Now, there's quite a few interesting places you can go on the internet to take a look at how reason helps you to overcome what might appear to be optical illusion. And again, I'll be putting up some links that are added only as options that you can explore just to see what I'm talking about. As is often the case in Western thought, there seems to be kind of a dominant male, if you will, component. However, it's something worth considering, and that is that women philosophers and intellectuals have been around for a long, long time. Unfortunately, they haven't always gotten the press or the publicity that maybe some of their male counterparts have gotten. But certainly Aristotle thought that men were linked with reason, and to some extent women were linked more to emotional aspects or nature, and there might be a whole history, by the way, of religio-spiritual thought involved in that. But it's interesting to note that there was a person of historical moment named Diotima, a female, who actually was a mentor of Socrates, and she taught him everything he needed to know about sustained reasoning, sustained deductive reasoning at a highly developed abstract logical level. So I mention this simply because of the fact that men and women both do extremely well in critical thinking and logic, and my joke is always that in my classes, at least critical thinking classes, in terms of sheer scores, women generally do better in logic than men do. But I leave that up to you to decide based upon your own anecdotal experience. Reason, interesting enough, can operate at the conscious and unconscious levels. If you really consciously set about to exercise your faculty, as they used to say, of reason, then you obviously are structuring an approach that you take to the solution of a problem or the development, let us say, of an argument you might be working on. But it's also true that there's certain unconscious and automatic occurrences or events that also seem to have a reasonable pattern to them. I've seen some of the brain studies, brain function, and it looks like even dreams have a certain cerebral activity resembles that of the conscious mind. Now, of course, you're not completely unconscious, presumably, when you're dreaming, but you're not clearly in a wakeful state. There have been many breakthroughs. Dmitri Mendeleev, mentioned here, came up with the periodic table. There have been famous mathematicians in the past who dreamt solution to their problems, and I would be the last to tell you not to pay much attention to dreams. And certainly, of course, the point of this slide is to suggest that we have various conscious levels or levels of consciousness, you might say, some of which we'd call subconscious, some of which we call unconscious. But reason doesn't necessarily always need to be functioning at the conscious level. There was a book that came out not long ago called Blink, B-L-I-N-K. And the interesting thesis of that book was that many people who are experts in certain fields are able to arrive at decisions extremely quickly, reasonable decisions, but they don't seem to be doing it necessarily consciously. They're not really thinking of premises and evidence consciously, but they come to reasonable conclusions about things. These are people who have a lot of experience, usually associated with a high degree of expertise. One specific example mentioned in that book was that of a person who assesses art objects for a museum and can tell fairly quickly what is a genuine art object and worth something and what isn't. And then they can later reconstruct the reasons that they believe support their position. But at the time they make the decision, they are not consciously really aware of a rational, logical process. That all seems to be going on in terms of just normal automatic brain function. Very interesting. You can't get away with critical thinking unless, of course, you incorporate elements of reason or reasoning into it. Because why? Because reason helps us analyze beliefs and evidence, and to try to make good choices about a variety of things, including life choices, as mentioned here. How to actually practically live. Reason works with other faculties, however, such as emotion and passion and intuition, I would add as well. And, to some extent, the mix of those things have to do, really, with something very simple. One's personality. You can take various personality tests and discover for yourself if you're preponderantly a person who relies upon structured reason, or perhaps mostly you have a preponderance for intuition, or you rely on the way you feel. Different character types, different personalities actually focus more on one thing than another. But the point, of course, here is, as we'll see as this little presentation does proceed toward the end, that a balance is appropriate, not a complete exclusion of one or the other. Ultimately, what we want to do is understand the role that emotion might play in critical thinking. Now, here should be a kind of an object lesson. One good place to start when you're trying to define a term is a good dictionary. Webster's College Dictionary is widespread, got a good reputation, but that's not the end. When you investigate a word and try to find the meaning of a concept, you might start with a good dictionary. I would recommend not necessarily completely devoting your research to something like Wikipedia, however. Wikipedia is oftentimes not moderated, and while it does appear to be a quite legitimate source of information about concepts and terminology, you got to just be a little bit careful depending upon whether or not it's a moderated or unmoderated kind of posting about a specific word. A hard copy Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, or a hard copy, if you can get one, Dictionary of the English Language from Oxford, which I think is like a 20-volume set. That would be a good place also to go and take a look at words like mind, intelligence, and emotion. But anyway, according to Webster's, emotion is a state of consciousness in which joy, sorrow, fear, etc., those things are experienced, as distinguished from cognitive and volitional consciousness. So when you say cognitive, we're talking about information content. Cognition, consciously, is the structured approach to thinking about something, and thus experiencing it in your mind, so to speak, or in your consciousness in a certain way. Volition, that's a nice word that doesn't get used that much, but it means to will something. In Western culture, emotion has been often viewed as the opposite of reason, and many other cultures, contrary to what is called sometimes a Western tradition, equally emphasize both and recognize that they both have a positive contributions that can be made to critical thinking. It's probably less so now than it has been historically, where we have had thinkers, particularly like Aristotle, for example, in the Greek tradition, to some extent Plato. Reason is a powerful tool, and obviously if you allow quote-unquote emotion to override reason, sometimes that can lead to destructive consequences. So again, I would argue that probably you need to see it as a balanced act, a balancing act between emotion and reason. As critical thinkers, you and I both need to be aware of the dangers of emotions like anger, fear. Sometimes, if you feel angry or fearful, I'm sure you've experienced this, it can tend to obscure your vision of what you're trying to accomplish, and you may not think clearly. You have to kind of wipe the slate clean at times so that you can be, as we say sometimes now, fondly objective. Needing to be objective means to some extent overcoming things such as anger and fear and other kinds of emotions, let us say, that dispose one to not seeing an issue clearly. But if you can make very good use of other things such as empathy, compassion, and others, perhaps we can enhance our critical thinking abilities. And I think that probably if you've done any kind of, and I'm sure by now you have, work or activity, just in the community, at school, at home, you're probably already using, to some extent, a good deal of critical thinking, and you probably already noticed that oftentimes if you get severely emotional, it can actually impede your ability to understand and evaluate an issue and arrive at a conclusion. But we still need to talk a little bit about the importance of emotion and the idea of emotional intelligence, which is something, again, that some people have in a higher degree, some people have in a lesser degree. If you can assess a person's emotions, or your own, express them appropriately, to some extent regulate them. That's been a common theme, actually, in many Western philosophers' ideas, regulating. Not so much controlling, but regulating it. In other words, if you let your emotions get the better of you, which we often say, it can again result in a situation which perhaps what you're trying to do or think, or what conclusion you're arriving at, is distorted ever so slightly. Emotions such as empathy, moral indignation, love, happiness, guilt can actually have a positive effect on reasoning because they're there in the background, possibly compelling us to engage in reasoning processes even at a higher degree of, let us say, competence. I think a case in point might just be, for example, if you're maybe like me, some people are, I'm a little concerned sometimes about the way in which nature or the environment gets trashed, oftentimes, by what humans do, or the way in which perhaps animals are mistreated. Well, for the most part, I suppose I have an empathic sort of, or even morally indignant response to situations in which, let us say, I see an animal being mistreated, like a dog or a cat or some such other creature, perhaps out in the wild. Well, first, it would seem I have a kind of an empathy for these creatures, a fellow creature feeling. I feel sorry for them. I'm morally indignant, or I have some kind of a moral concern over their mistreatment. And from that, I perhaps use critical thinking to construct arguments and also to determine the kind of behavior I have to engage in order to confront or to stop it, or to at least raise my voice against it. So that's kind of how that goes. That's if you had no emotion at all, you wonder if you would actually be out there in the world, or anybody would be out there doing things like trying to correct injustice. An empathetic person is flexible and open to other perspectives, and this openness motivates critical analysis of problems. So one of the qualities of a critical thinker, it could be argued, is having an empathetic capacity to be able to be objective and take into consideration somebody else's point of view, see what kind of perspective the other person has. That's the beginning of having a good dialogue using critical thinking. Trying to understand what another person is saying or what they really believe. Help them understand what they themselves believe. Good dialogue, good philosophical discussion using critical thinking can help do that. There are times when other kinds of emotions can work against the critical thinking process. While they can motivate better decision making, they can also hinder it. Fear and anger and other things tend to do that. If you're really fearful, it has a tendency to preoccupy you at times. If you're extremely angry, I've certainly had an occasion on which I'd be involved in some dispute and get angered and perhaps discover in retrospect that I should have gotten control of that anger. Fortunately, most people don't have an anger management problem, but anger is a normal issue. And of course I don't have one of those either, and I'm not meaning to imply that, but anger can be something that all of us, any one of us, need to get a handle on. And that would be true in daily life, and it certainly is true in critical thinking. And again, a case of that is, what if you got really angry at the mistreatment of another creature, of a dog or a cat? And it might prompt you to do something that perhaps is not as rational as it would have been if you just stood back and regulated or got control of the anger. That's the way that probably goes. We're also vulnerable to emotional appeals, and of course we're going to see those in advertising and political campaigns. You've encountered them, I'm sure, all your life. People trying to convince you to look a certain way, buy a certain object. We'll be spending quite a bit of time analyzing emotional appeals, and we'll call them ultimately rhetorical fallacies, many of them in any case, that are riddled through and through the advertising and marketing kinds of information that we receive almost on a daily basis. When somebody makes an emotional appeal to somebody else, often those appeals are devoid of good evidence and good reasoning. You know, if somebody wants you to buy something, then logically, from a critical thinking point of view, you should be empowered to see the good reasons, if there are any, for the purchase of a product. You know, how many things have you perhaps bought that you quote-unquote later realized you didn't really need it, but you just wanted it? With the new Macintosh device that's out, the iPad, some people argue that that's not a terribly good name for it, but that's what we have now. I'm convinced that there'll be many people waiting in line when it finally comes forth, as they did with the first edition of the iPod, and buy it, and want it desperately, and maybe on analysis they realize they didn't really need it. I'm not saying all people. I'm saying there are probably a good percentage of people, and I've talked to a couple of them actually personally, who, whether it's that kind of a product or something else, they might purchase because they were emotionally appealed to. An answer to some of this issue with regard to reason versus emotion has already been dealt with by philosophers in many different traditions. And I'm going to just simply summarize our views here. We'll expatiate upon them in later presentations, to some extent anyway. Plato's solution was to harmonize all the parts of the soul. He divided the soul up into reason, passion, and appetite, and Plato wanted all the parts of one's individual quote-unquote soul or psyche completely harmonized. That would lead to a balanced life. His pupil, Aristotle, thought we should engage in activities moderately and always exercise balance and moderation. In much the same way, much of what I've encountered in Native American philosophy stresses moderation, balance, non-excess use. Particularly see this with respect to some of the Native American websites and information and philosophical tracts on mankind's involvement with the environment and the treatment of other beings in that environment. Typical Native American philosophy, as such, seems to stress the idea of balance and non-intrusiveness and not engaging in excess. You see a common theme here. Even in Buddhism, the Eightfold Path that comes from the Four Noble Truths stresses moderation. And of course, even in Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, there's a kind of a humbleness, modesty, moderation, a balance again there. So there seems to be a common theme from many different philosophical arenas and cultures throughout the world. And you could say that there really was a strong sense of using reason to help balance the other aspects of one's character, personality, or soul, if you prefer to put it that way. One thing that we probably should consider doing is integrating both reason and emotion. That means putting them together so that they work with each other as opposed to against each other. You know, just from an organic, physiological point of view, emotion can clearly alert us to problems. It can clearly give us an insight or a step in direction in the direction of giving us insight into other people's problems. And of course, you need emotion to motivate action. In fact, that's almost exactly what that word means, emote. In a sense, what this means is to give movement to. So emotion is one of those capacities that we have that allows us to be able actually to go forth and act on something that we think is reasonable. So the idea, of course, is to harmonize these things and thus become better informed about our decision making. Now, this chapter also dealt with artificial intelligence, and I find it an incredibly fascinating subject. I'm going to show you a little video I put together here shortly on the next slide, I believe, and you can watch it and glean for yourself what it's attempting to show. But when you think about artificial intelligence in relation to reason, in relation to human intelligence, it's interesting. Artificial intelligence can be defined as a study of computations that make it possible to perceive, reason, and act. And of course, people who engage in research in artificial intelligence often have these kinds of goals, and that is the enhancement of human reasoning, the creation of intelligent machines, the development of sociable intelligent machines that can cooperate with people. Now, probably by now, you've forgotten, even if, it's only been about 10 years old, I think, the movie AI by Steven Spielberg. Interesting, very interesting, long drawn-out movie, but there's some aspects of that movie that are quite relevant to a discussion about this. When you think about the little boy who clearly is intelligent, even though we know he's artificial in that movie, can reason, can act, can be somewhat sociable, maybe has a certain lacking of emotional intelligence, but still, if you can conceive of a being like that, then you can certainly conceive of an entity like that using critical thinking. Given the advances in artificial intelligence and its inquiries and researches, we ought to perhaps move beyond questioning whether AI is capable of reasoning and not hold AI to higher standards of proof than we apply to humanity. Now, this is kind of a statement that implies some familiarity on our parts with the current controversy that exists between those people who think there can be such a thing as artificial intelligence and those people who think that maybe there already is. And to some extent, you know, there are some machines that you've probably actually utilized yourself that are highly artificially, I would say, quote-unquote, intelligent. You know, think about what the term intelligence means. We're going to look at that in just a few seconds here. Now, here's a little video, and hopefully you'll be able to hear the audio real well here on this. I'm going to take you to YouTube and put the microphone up to the speaker and give you a couple of minutes of this. And if you can't see it too terribly well here in this environment, you can go to YouTube and find it.
If you'd like to hear it, I can sing it for you.
Yes, I'd like to hear it, Hal. Sing it for me.
It's called Daisy.
His name is David.
Feel it. It's creepy. Whoa. It's so real.
In a distant future, in an age of intelligent machines, he is the first robotic child programmed to love and coexist as a member of a family. His is a
Well, hopefully you got a little bit out of that. That's on YouTube, and I helped a couple of students put that together. They were working on a critical thinking project on artificial intelligence last summer in one of my colleagues' courses, Dr. Sheila Pawar, here at Cal State. And we had a very good time assembling it, but the point, of course, here is to put in a nutshell what artificial intelligence would look like, and clearly how you can note that a good deal of the creatures or entities that are featured here have humanoid or human-like intellectual and even physical capacities. In some cases surpass your typical human capacity in either of those two areas. So just something to think about a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about faith and reason, a little bit different than emotion and reason. Faith can involve belief in God and in many other things, mind you, but faith with a big F on it. Faith usually means faith in the supernatural or some being or beings that, generally speaking, are not detectable and not part of our ordinary earthly terrestrial experience. Traditionally, faith and reason have been seen as sometimes uneasy co-inhabitants. And it does sometimes seem to be true to say that whatever one's personal beliefs are, it's important for us as critical thinkers to connect faith with reason to balance belief and doubt. So in other words, you know, you can get into discussions, as I'm sure you probably have gotten into, certainly in philosophy classes, where people debate about the existence of God, or the non-existence of God, or other kinds of entities, possibly even UFOs, things of this nature. I truly believe that there are some people that have a faith that UFOs exist. And, you know, when one says it that way, you seem to be suggesting that it is only a belief, a strongly held belief, that doesn't necessarily have too much substantiation or support. At the same time, when you think about the function of faith in normal contexts, you and I, probably both of us, have a certain faith in the way in which the world works, a certain faith in the idea that the world is seemingly consistent in weather patterns. Sometimes unexpected weather phenomena occur or geotechnical issues occur, like earthquakes, that were not predicted, not really a part of your typical experience, but still, there's a kind of a continuity, a consistency in our experience. And we have faith that it will continue into the future. We even have I'm sure, something like faith with a small f, that our car will start in the morning when we're on our way to work or to school. Faith, obviously, in religious context is a little bit different, and we're just simply talking about it here to show that it can be included, along with emotion, into the overall pattern of critical thinking. Integrating reason and faith allows us to evaluate competing claims of faith and revelation, and to question faith-based claims that are inconsistent with evidence. So, you know, it is true that that many people in the past have attempted to try to consolidate both faith and reason. We'll discuss them in just a moment. But when we do have an issue with regard to faith on one hand, reason on the other, and we're trying to integrate them, it probably boils down to three main categories. Fideism suggests that faith transcends reason, and that the divine is revealed through faith and revelation, and not reason or empirical evidence. In other words, fideists tend to believe that whatever it is that is the divine is communicated to an individual not via the normal pathways by means of which a person acquires information about the world. Rationalism, on the other hand, argues that religious beliefs should be consistent with reason and evidence. And critical rationalism argues that divine knowledge can derive both from faith and reason, and that both sources should be compatible with one another. So, there are probably some other subcategories of these, but the rationalist approach was taken by many philosophers and theologians in the past, among them being somebody such as St. Thomas, who could either be a kind of compatibilist or a rationalist, if you will. If we go back, he could also be construed to be a critical rationalist, but he did try to provide theology in those days with rational arguments regarding the existence of God, and came up with something you may have encountered at some point in time: the 5 ways that offer proof of God's existence. So if you don't like one of them, you'll take the other 4. And of course, we will discuss some of the patterns of the kind of argumentation that somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas and his followers and close associates came up with. Deductive type arguments, inductive type arguments, arguments from contingency, arguments about the essential nature of God, ontological argument, etc. We'll cover some of those when we get to deductive and inductive argumentation. So in a sense, we'll resume this and show you the degree to which reason, in the case of somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas and many other theologians, actually supports or combines with faith. Another famous philosopher, Avicenna, was a theologian and a logician who contributed enormously to Islamic theology and philosophy, and of course to a general intellectual understanding of belief and faith in many, many scholastic type and academic type theological traditions. Once again, I would regard this as a kind of a combo package approach to the idea about the truth of the existence of God at a philosophical level. It's critical thinking, logic, reason, emotion, mixed in to some extent combined with faith. Buddhist logic, some would probably argue that the term faith isn't necessarily utilized or could be utilized in this context, but we have the teacher Bhavaviveka, who employed formal syllogistic logic, and you'll learn much, much more about syllogisms, and you probably won't like me for it, but you will learn it a couple of weeks down the line here, if you haven't encountered it already, to provide rationale for Buddhist metaphysics. So here you have another tradition which is using a more formal kind of critical thinking, but to support the insights or revelations that were achieved through the Buddhist canon. So let's conclude. As the previous slides have, I think, shown to some extent, or at least implied, to be a critical, an effective critical thinker, you need to use both reason and emotion. And of course, since you're a human being, it's very important to consider that you're pretty much saddled with those things. It's also possible to harmonize reason and faith and do critical thinking about one's religious values. That's the philosophical thing to do, to look at arguments for and against certain positions in almost any field. That's what we philosophers do. Sometimes we take great risk in doing it, because let's face it, people do have an emotional commitment oftentimes to their belief systems, whether they be religious or otherwise. So I hope you enjoyed this to some extent. Again, you can go back and replay this at will if you decide to do so. And in this particular instance, I may go ahead and create an MP3 file for you as well. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.